Mark Carney keeps saying 85% of Canada's trade with the United States is tariff-free.
Canadian technology, Canadian lumber, and Canadian values. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. In an effort to get to most of our journalists on the line here, we'll do one question, no follow-ups. We'll do about 15 minutes of questions. Première question, first question.
Good morning, almost good afternoon, Prime Minister Carney.
Thank you.
My name is Claudia Van Emmerich. I'm with Global News. My question for you is that the Trump administration has increased the general tariff rate as well as double tariffs on steel and aluminum, yet your government has not retaliated. How do you justify it to Canadians who have voted you in to be elbows up against Trump that your government has not fired back, that you have not retaliated? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. I think the first thing to recognize is, and I said this in my remarks, but I'm going to repeat for emphasis, which is that 85% of the trade between Canada and the United States is tariff-free. That's our exports to the United States, that's U.S. exports to Canada. And we recognize that. We recognize very much the United States reaffirmation of this core element of CUSMA, or what they would call USMCA. So it's important to preserve that. It's important to reinforce that. And part of our discussions is about that. We are also very cognizant that in about 9 months from now, the first review of USMCA, CUSMA as we call it, will begin between the three parties. So there's a bigger picture there. The third thing, just from context, is we've always said that we will apply tariffs where they had the maximum impact in the United States and a minimum impact in Canada. And so we don't automatically adjust. We look at what we can do for our industry that's most effective. In some cases, that will be to remove tariffs. We have removed some tariffs over time so that, for example, the auto industry can function more effectively. And we'll look at opportunities to do so, because in the end, we're looking at having the best impact in Canada. The last point, if I may.
When questioned about not retaliating against Trump's tariffs, Carney explains that 85% of Canada-U.S. trade remains tariff-free and emphasizes the importance of preserving CUSMA. He states Canada applies tariffs strategically for maximum impact on the U.S. with minimum impact on Canada, focusing instead on a positive agenda of building domestic strength, improving competitiveness, and diversifying trade relationships rather than automatic retaliation. But that statistic is hiding a much darker reality about what Trump's trade war is actually doing to Canadian businesses. Prime Minister Carney has been throwing around this 85% figure like it's some kind of shield against Trump's escalating tariffs. He said it again on Tuesday and repeated it on Friday when pressed about his response to Trump's devastating 35% tariff hike on Canadian goods that aren't CUSMA compliant. We're in a situation right now where 85% of our trade with the United States is tariff-free, Carney told reporters in Trenton, Ontario. But here's what Carney isn't telling you, and what every Canadian business owner needs to understand. That 85% figure only describes Canada's exports that have the potential to qualify for exemptions under the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. It doesn't represent the proportion of exports that's actually being spared from Trump's punishing tariffs. This isn't just a numbers game, it's about real businesses facing real costs that could destroy their bottom line.
Well, Wolf, these are historic tariff levels not seen in nearly a century. We have not seen tariffs at these rates since the 1930s, and following that was the Great Depression. And all countries are being hit. The minimum is 10%, but then it's ratcheted up to 50% for some countries. This is President Trump's big bet. He believes that he's going to shrink trade deficits with other countries and believes that he's going to move manufacturing to the United States. Here are some of the countries that are impacted. Look at that high rate for Brazil. Switzerland, 39%. That's actually higher than the initial tariff of 31% that was announced on Liberation Day. You have India, 25%. Trump has threatened to move that up to 50%. Vietnam, Cambodia, other East Asian countries at 20%, 19%. And the European Union, a major trading partner, Wolf, sitting at 15%. They actually negotiated that tariff level as Trump was trying to bring that even higher. But a significant historic day as nearly all countries now hit with historic tariff levels.
Vanessa, how much is this going to cost average Americans?
Yeah, well, this is going to hit a lot of products that we Americans love to buy. Computers, electronics, coming in from countries like China, Vietnam.
CNN correspondent details that tariffs are at historic levels not seen since the 1930s Great Depression, with rates ranging from 10% minimum to 50% for some countries. The report lists specific tariffs: Brazil and Switzerland at 39%, India at 25%, Vietnam and Cambodia at 20%, and the EU at 15%. Products affected include computers, electronics, clothing, shoes, watches, alcohol, and toys, with Yale Budget Lab projecting these tariffs will cost the average American family $2,400 per year. Tyler Meredith, founding partner of Meredith, Boson, Cool & Phillips and a former economic advisor to the Trudeau government, argues that citing this percentage alone completely understates the financial devastation Canadian businesses are experiencing as Trump ramps up his tariff assault. The real numbers tell a completely different story. U.S. Census Bureau data reveals that last year, only about 38% of U.S. imports from Canada were actually traded under CUSMA provisions. That's less than half of what Carney's 85% figure suggests. An analysis by the Yale Budget Lab published Thursday assumed that only 50% of Canada's exports to the U.S. are currently certified under CUSMA. So while Carney talks about 85% potential exemptions, the reality is that potentially half of Canadian exports are getting hammered by Trump's tariffs right now. The gap between Carney's talking points and the brutal economic reality is staggering. But why is there such a massive disconnect between potential exemptions and actual exemptions? The answer reveals another layer of how Trump's trade war is systematically weakening Canadian competitiveness. Applying for CUSMA exemptions is a bureaucratic nightmare, especially for small businesses. The certification process is complex, expensive, and time-consuming. Products must meet specific rules of origin requirements, and eligibility is determined case by case, since they must meet product-specific requirements that vary across different industries. For small Canadian exporters who were previously trading under most favored nation status, which allowed them to trade with very low tariffs or none at all without registering for preferential treatment, Trump's tariffs have created an impossible choice. They can either absorb the crushing costs of CUSMA certification, or they can look beyond the U.S. market entirely. Meredith warns that this dynamic is already reshaping Canada's economic landscape in ways that could permanently damage the country's prosperity. We are one of the most trade-dependent on the United States of any developed country, Meredith explains. If the consequence is that trade overall falls, as we are seeing now in the data, that's going to be a cost that we disproportionately bear relative to other countries. This is the hidden cost of Trump's strategy that Carney's 85% statistic completely obscures. Even if the majority of trade has the potential to be tariff-free, the administrative burden and uncertainty Trump has created is forcing Canadian businesses to make strategic decisions that could permanently weaken Canada's economic ties to its largest trading partner. The timing couldn't be worse. Trump imposed his 35% tariff increase after Canada failed to reach a deal by his Friday deadline. This represents a sharp escalation from the previous 25% rate, and it's specifically targeting Canadian goods that aren't CUSMA compliant.
Well, I think it's because of the feeling in the room or the energy in the room when the negotiators are talking to each other. And, so the decision was made by our team, to the president. The president decided, let's give Mexico an extension, put the 35% tariff on Canada. But remember, this is for non-USMCA compliant products. So I've talked to your ambassador, the U.S. Ambassador Hillman. I think she's characterized Canada's position right now as one that lots of countries around the world would be envious of, because the effective tariff rate for Canada right now on all goods and services going into the U.S. is about 5%. That's not a bad place for Canada to be right now.
So if I understand your answer to that question correctly, you're saying it's the energy in the room is the reason why Canada got hit and Mexico did not?
Well, Canada really, number one, Canada really didn't get hit very hard. Okay?
But still got hit,
But
and Mexico did not.
Mexico did not, and it's, the negotiators, I'm assuming, are sitting in the room and saying, okay, we're making, the negotiations that we're in right now with Mexico and where where we believe we are headed, say, we're making significant progress.
Ambassador Pete Hoekstra attempts to explain why Mexico received an extension on trade negotiations, while Canada faced immediate 35% tariffs on non-USMCA compliant goods. He vaguely attributes it to the feeling in the room or the energy in the room when the negotiators are talking, and suggests the negotiations with Mexico showed more progress. He struggles to provide specific reasons, repeatedly stating he's not in the room while emphasizing that Canada's effective tariff rate remains relatively low at about 5%. But Trump isn't stopping there. He's also maintaining separate 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, 25% tariffs on automobiles, and devastating anti-dumping duties on Canadian softwood lumber that industry leaders are calling a gut punch. The cumulative effect of these measures goes far beyond what Carney's 85% figure suggests. Entire sectors of the Canadian economy are being systematically targeted, and businesses are facing compound pressures that could force them out of the U.S. market entirely. What makes this even more concerning is how Trump is using these tariffs as leverage for broader geopolitical objectives. The White House explicitly blamed Canada's insufficient cooperation in combating cross-border fentanyl trafficking as justification for the tariff increase. Trump's administration claims that fentanyl seizures at the northern border have surpassed the total seizures from the past 3 years, and they estimate the amount seized could have killed more than 16 million Americans. This represents a fundamental shift in how trade disputes are being weaponized. Trump isn't just using tariffs to address economic grievances, he's tying them to national security concerns in ways that make traditional trade negotiations almost impossible. How do you negotiate economic terms when the other side is framing the dispute as a matter of life and death for American citizens? Carney's response has been notably restrained, which some observers interpret as strategic patience, while others see it as dangerous passivity. Rather than retaliating with matching tariffs, Carney has suggested he's open to removing existing Canadian tariffs if it would help Canadian industries. "We don't automatically adjust," Carney explained. "We look at what we can do for our industry that's most effective. In some cases, that will be to remove tariffs." This approach represents a dramatic departure from the dollar-for-dollar retaliation strategy that Canada employed during previous trade disputes. Some business leaders are supporting Carney's measured approach, arguing that no deal is better than a bad deal. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce backed Carney's decision to prioritize a strong, future-focused deal over a rushed one. But others are questioning whether Canada is projecting weakness at a moment when Trump respects only strength. The stakes extend far beyond the immediate economic impact. Ontario Premier Doug Ford is warning that Trump is preparing to renegotiate the entire USMCA agreement ahead of schedule, potentially as early as November. Ford believes Trump could pull the carpet out from underneath us on CUSMA tomorrow with one signature, fundamentally reshaping North American trade relationships in ways that could permanently disadvantage Canada. This broader context makes Carney's 85% statistic even more misleading. If Trump succeeds in forcing an early USMCA renegotiation under more favorable terms for the United States, even that 85% potential exemption rate could evaporate overnight. The agreement that currently provides the legal framework for most tariff-free trade between the countries could be rewritten to give the U.S. even more leverage over Canadian exporters. Meanwhile, the human cost of this trade war is becoming increasingly visible. British Columbia's forestry industry has seen thousands of workers laid off over recent years, and the latest round of softwood lumber duties is being described as devastating. Carney announced $1.2 billion in support for the Canadian softwood industry, but industry leaders question whether government support can offset the market access they're losing to punitive U.S. tariffs. The broader pattern is clear. Trump is systematically using tariffs to force Canada into a position where it either accepts unfavorable trade terms or faces escalating economic pressure that could permanently damage key industries.
Okay, so let me be very clear. I'm 100% supportive of the Prime Minister and the federal government. And when you sit around at a family dinner table, you discuss all sorts of ideas, and that's what we're going to do. But just in the last 3 months, we've seen the U.S. auto industry face $6.2 billion in tariff-related costs, with most of them projecting significantly higher costs for the year. We're looking at 37,000 manufacturing jobs that have disappeared in the U.S., and factory employment is the lowest it's been in 5 years, which is not a good thing. And you see what happens with President Trump. Someone gives them the wrong job numbers that are accurate job numbers, they get fired. Well, you know, President Trump has to realize it's costing companies billions of dollars. Procter & Gamble cost them $1 billion. You look at Mattel, you look at all the Ford Motor Company and all the auto companies. He said it would create economic growth. He said it would create jobs. I went out there at the same time and said it's going to be a disaster. Tariff on Canada is going to be a tax on Americans. So far, this is what's happened. It's hurting American companies. So they need to shift and start looking at working collaboratively with us, looking at the AMCAN fortress, put a ring around America and the U.S., in Canada, have the two strongest nations in the world. We could thrive and prosper. He'd rather fight. I don't want to fight. I want to fight with our closest allies and friends. And be very frank, neither do the governors, the senators, the Congress people. They don't want to fight with our closest allies.
The premier strongly addresses the impact of U.S. tariffs, stating he's 100% supportive of the Prime Minister and the federal government. He details how U.S. tariffs have cost the American auto industry $6.2 billion in just 3 months, eliminated 37,000 manufacturing jobs, and hurt major companies like Procter & Gamble and Ford. He emphasizes that tariff on Canada is going to be a tax on Americans and advocates for collaborative work between the U.S. and Canada as the two strongest nations in the world. Carney's 85% figure creates a false sense of security that obscures how vulnerable Canada actually is to this strategy. What's particularly concerning is how this dynamic could accelerate under a potential second Trump term. The current tariff levels represent just the opening moves in what could become a much broader economic confrontation. Trump has already demonstrated his willingness to escalate tariffs rapidly and to tie trade disputes to unrelated political objectives. Canadian businesses are already adapting to this new reality in ways that could permanently reshape the country's economic relationship with the United States. Some are investing in a CUSMA certification despite the costs. Others are exploring alternative markets. Many are simply absorbing higher costs and hoping the political situation improves. But none of these adaptations address the fundamental vulnerability that Carney's 85% statistic obscures. Canada's economy remains overwhelmingly dependent on U.S. market access, and Trump has demonstrated both the willingness and ability to weaponize that dependence for political gain. The question facing Canada isn't whether 85% of trade has the potential to be tariff-free. The question is whether Canada can develop the economic resilience and political leverage necessary to protect its interests when those exemptions are being used as bargaining chips in a much larger geopolitical game. Carney's focus on building domestic economic strength and diversifying trade relationships represents a long-term strategic response to this vulnerability. His government is promoting major infrastructure projects with provincial and Indigenous partners that could catalyze over $500 billion in new investments. The Build Canada Homes program promises to use Canadian lumber and workers for domestic construction projects, reducing dependence on U.S. market access. But these initiatives will take years to materialize, while Trump's tariffs are creating immediate pressure that could force Canadian businesses out of their most important market. The disconnect between Carney's optimistic rhetoric and the harsh economic reality facing Canadian exporters reflects a broader challenge in how democratic governments communicate about economic warfare. Political leaders need to project confidence and control, even when facing adversaries who are willing to use economic disruption as a weapon. Carney's 85% statistic serves this political function by suggesting that Canada has more protection than it actually possesses. But this messaging strategy comes with serious risks. If Canadian businesses and investors make strategic decisions, based on false confidence about their market access, they could be caught unprepared when Trump escalates his trade war further. The gap between political messaging and economic reality could amplify the damage when the next round of tariffs hits. What makes this situation even more dangerous is how it's unfolding alongside broader shifts in global trade relationships. Trump isn't just targeting Canada, he's imposed steep tariffs on Brazil, India, Taiwan, and other countries as part of a comprehensive restructuring of America's economic relationships. This suggests that Canada's trade challenges with the U.S. aren't isolated incidents that can be resolved through bilateral negotiations. They're part of a broader American strategy to use economic pressure as a tool of foreign policy.
Very, very tough.
So no matter what, are tariffs, I guess another question is, are tariffs just here to stay?
From the
American
Donald Trump
perspective,
the answer is yes. I think the president has made it clear that we will have a new trade regime where there will be tariffs for every single country in the world.
When asked if tariffs are permanent, Ambassador Hoekstra definitively states the answer is yes, confirming President Trump's vision of a new trade regime where there will be tariffs for every single country in the world. This stark admission confirms the fundamental shift in U.S. trade policy regardless of negotiations. In this context, Carney's emphasis on diversifying trade relationships and building domestic economic capacity represents a recognition that Canada can no longer rely on the stable, predictable trade relationship with the United States that defined the post-war economic order. The 85% tariff-free statistic becomes not just misleading, but actively harmful if it prevents Canadians from understanding how fundamentally their economic relationship with the United States has changed. The real story isn't that 85% of Canada's trade with the U.S. is tariff-free. The real story is that Trump has weaponized the 15% that isn't, and he's using that leverage to reshape the entire relationship on terms more favorable to American interests. Canadian businesses, investors, and policymakers need to understand this reality if they're going to navigate the challenges ahead. Carney's government faces the difficult task of preparing Canada for a more confrontational economic relationship with the United States while maintaining the diplomatic and trade ties that remain essential for Canadian prosperity. The success of this strategy will depend not on statistical sleight of hand, but on Canada's ability to build real economic resilience and political leverage in an increasingly unstable global trade environment. The 85% figure that Carney keeps citing isn't just incomplete, it's a dangerous distraction from the hard work of building that resilience. Canadian businesses and citizens deserve a more honest accounting of the challenges they face, and a more realistic assessment of what it will take to protect Canadian interests in Trump's new economic order.